The candles had not been lit in the east hallway, and so Dorothy Penn carried them there herself. The tray balanced in both hands, the pale stubs of tallow arranged in a row like a small procession of the departed. She had been in service at Ashfield Hall 6 years. She knew the sound the east hallway made in November, a low insistent draft from the seam beneath the outer door, and she knew the exact moment she would pass the drawing room, and she knew, this evening, that the drawing room door stood open. She did not mean to stop. She had learned that a maid who stopped in hallways was a maid who heard things she was not meant to hear, and a maid who heard things she was not meant to hear was a maid who found herself dismissed before the season turned. She stopped. Through the open door she could see the long table. 6 men were arranged around it, some seated, some standing near the fire, and at the head of it stood a man she recognized as Mr. Spohr. Roper, the solicitor who had arrived that morning with a leather case and an air of settled authority. He held a document. He was reading from it aloud. She could not follow the words the same way written lines swam, and refused to resolve into meaning when she tried to look at them too long. She had been born, her mother said, without the gift for letters. She had spent 22 years learning to compensate for that absence by sharpening everything else. So she did not hear the words. She saw the table. On the far end of it, anchoring a stack of papers, was a disc of red wax. A seal. Not loose, not pressed into the document Mr. Roper held set apart. As though it had been placed there for reference or display, she looked at it the way she looked at everything in this house. She had cleaned the late master's study every Thursday for 3 years. She had lifted every object on his desk and set it down again in its proper place. She knew his signet ring by sight and by the particular weight of it in her cloth when she polished it. She knew the impression it left when it was pressed into wax, the slight irregularity on the left side of the crest where the gold had worn the seal on the table was not right. The impression was cleaner. Younger. Somehow. The worn edge was not there. She did not know the word for this certainty. She only knew she had it. Mrs. Cecily Norwood sat at the near end of the table with her hands folded in her lap, her face holding the stillness of a woman who has understood her situation and chosen, in the absence of any other option, to be still. She was 30 years old and had been a widow for 7 weeks. The document Mr. Roper held was a codicil to the late master's will, redirecting Ashfield Hall and its income away from Mrs. Norwood and toward a distant cousin named Aldous Vane, who stood near the fire in a coat that fit him too well for a man who had not known, until a fortnight ago, that he stood to inherit anything. Dorothy turned away. She carried the candles to the east hallway, and she lit them one by one. And her hands were steady, and she did not let herself think about what she had seen until much later, when she was alone in the servants' hall and the house had gone quiet around her. She thought the seal was wrong. She thought she did not know how to say that to anyone who would hear it. She thought of the wax disc she had found on the study floor 2 months ago, the morning after the master sealed his will in the presence of witnesses. It had fallen from the desk, or been knocked from it, or come loose in some accident of the afternoon. She had found it on the floor when she came to clean, and she had picked it up, and she had looked at it. The impression of the ring was clear. The worn edge on the left side of the crest was there, unmistakable, the way a fingerprint is unmistakable to the person who knows the hand it came from. She had not known what to do with it. It seemed wasteful to throw away. It seemed presumptuous to place it on the desk as though she had the authority to decide where things belonged. She had put it in her apron pocket, thinking she would leave it somewhere sensible when she thought of where sensible was. She had forgotten it was there. Now she reached into her apron and closed her hand around it, and it was still there. The small, hard disc of red wax, and the impression of the ring pressed into it, was still intact. She did not know what this meant in law. She did not know if it meant anything at all. She only knew what she knew, and what she knew was that the seal on the table was not the seal on the wax in her hand, and the seal on the table was on the document that was going to take Mrs. Norwood's home. She held the disc for a long time. Then she put it back in her pocket and she went to bed. Ashfield Hall, in those first weeks of the dispute, was a house that had learned to breathe carefully. Mrs. Norwood moved through the rooms with the quiet discipline of someone who understood that any visible distress would be interpreted as confirmation that she could not manage her affairs. And so she managed her affairs, and she was quiet, and she was dignified, and her hands did not shake in public. Dorothy had served under many mistresses. She had served none whose quiet courage she respected more. The household had contracted around that courage. Mrs. Ruth Ashby ran the servants with the same precision she had always employed, as though the normal patterns of a household could hold the situation at bay through sheer adherence. Dorothy cleaned the rooms that had always been her rooms to clean, and tried not to look at the places where Mr. Vane's man had already begun to measure the walls. Aldous Vane had installed himself in the yellow sitting room with a confidence so complete it had its own texture in the air around him. He was 38 years old, well made, with a pleasant face that did nothing to disguise the calculation behind it. His mother, Lady Constance Vane, had arrived 2 days after him with a traveling case, and the settled air of a woman who has come to supervise a transfer of property she has been anticipating for longer than was polite to admit. Lady Constance had the kind of beauty that had arranged itself, over the course of 60 years, into something nearer to authority than attractiveness. She wore it like a coat. She looked at the servants of Ashfield Hall with the specific assessment of a woman cataloguing what she intends to keep and what she intends to replace. She looked at Dorothy, and her gaze moved on, and she said to her son in a voice not quite low enough, "The girl cannot even sign her name. Whatever she imagines she witnessed, it amounts to nothing." She had not been speaking to Dorothy. She had been speaking past her, the way one speaks past a piece of furniture. Dorothy stood still and held the tray, and looked at the middle distance, and waited for the moment when she could leave the room. She had been told this many times in many registers, that what she could not read she could not understand, that what she could not write she could not remember, that her perception of events was shaped by an incapacity that rendered it unreliable. She had been told it so many times that she had sometimes believed it. On the bad days, she believed it completely. The bad days had been numerous this November. He arrived on a Wednesday, in the early afternoon, when the light was already failing, in the way it failed in November in that part of England, a slow compression of gray over gray. Dorothy was in the front hall when the carriage came up the drive, and she watched from the window, because watching from windows was the only intelligence she had access to. The man who descended from the carriage was not what she had expected. She had expected, perhaps, someone of Mr. Vane's type, well-made and comfortable. What she saw instead was a man who moved as though he was accustomed to rooms receiving him poorly, and had long since stopped requiring them to do otherwise. He was tall and lean, 34 or so, dark-haired, in a coat that had been excellent once, and was still excellent, but had been worn hard. He looked at the front of Ashfield Hall for a moment before he came to the door, and his face was still as water before it accepts a stone. His name, she learned from Mrs. Ashby, was Edward Carew, the Earl of Wenlock. He had been sent for by Mrs. Norwood's brother in London, who had read in the papers about the disputed codicil and had written to a man he knew at Lincoln's Inn, and the man at Lincoln's Inn had engaged the Earl of Wenlock, who was known, apparently for his understanding of estate law and the particular category of document disputes that had become, in recent years, distressingly common. Dorothy stored this information the way she stored all information, in the order in which she had received it, without reference to any written record, in the precise and organized space she had built inside herself, because she had no other place to keep things. She did not speak to him that first evening. She was not expected to. She brought a tray to the library, where he had asked to be established, and she set it down and she turned to leave. And he said, without looking up from the papers, "Mrs. Ma." Norwood had provided, "Thank you." It was a small thing. It landed with unexpected weight. In the library the following morning she found him early, before she had expected anyone to be there. She had come to organize the master's papers, which she had been doing every week for 3 years. When his eyesight began to fail, he had asked her to arrange the papers by some system that would allow him to call for what he needed. She could not organize them by what was written on them. She had organized them instead by every other quality a document possessed. Its size, its age, as she could read it by the color of its paper and the quality of its ink, the feel and weight of its binding, the nature and color of its sealing wax. She had built him, over the course of 2 years, a complete physical taxonomy of his papers, and he had been able to navigate it by her descriptions, and neither of them had ever needed to discuss the arrangement, because the arrangement worked. She had not told anyone else about the system. She had not thought to. It was simply the solution to a problem, and the problem was solved, and so there was nothing further to say about it. Lord Wenlock was at the far table when she entered, and he looked up, and she made to apologize for disturbing him, and leave with the papers she had come to collect, and he said, "Wait, not a request, not quite a command. Something in between, level and specific. What were you going to take?" She told him about the property deeds from the East Shropshire parcels, which she could identify because they were a specific shade of cream, folded in thirds rather than quarters, sealed with blue rather than red wax, and older than the other deeds by the texture of their binding. He looked at her for a long moment. "Can you show me which ones?" She showed him. She moved through the papers without hesitation, locating each deed by the system she had built, and she was aware of him watching her, not with the idle attention of a man waiting for a task to be completed, but with the specific quality of attention a man gives to something he has not seen before and is trying to understand. She did not look at him while she worked. She was accustomed to being observed by people who did not expect to find what they were observing. She had learned to let the observation pass through her, like a draft through a room. She collected the deeds and she went to leave, and he said, "Miss Penn." She stopped. He said, "You have done this before." "Yes, my lord," she said. "For 3 years." He looked at the table, where she had moved perhaps 40 documents with complete assurance and without a single error. "You have arranged these." "Yes, my lord. By what means?" She told him. She told him about the sizes, and the colors, and the weights, and the seals, and the system she had built, and how the master had used it. She told him, without any particular emotion, the way she would describe the cleaning rotation or the order of the linen press. It was information. She offered it as information. He was quiet for some time. After she finished, then he said, "Thank you, Miss Penn." And his voice had a particular quality that she could not name precisely, except that it did not sound like the voice of a man who had offered a courtesy and was now waiting for it to be accepted and departed with. It sounded like the voice of a man who meant something more than what he had said, and had not yet decided whether to say it. She left with the deeds. At the door she paused, not turning, and she reached into her apron pocket and closed her hand around the small wax disc, and she stood there for a moment with her back to the room. And then she walked on. She did not give it to him that day. She came close. Twice, in the next 3 days. "Indeed." Once, when he asked her, gently, and with apparent casualness, whether she had been present at any of the occasions when the master sealed documents, whether she would recognize the ring he used, she said yes, she would recognize it. He looked at her with the quiet intensity she had come to associate with him, specifically. That quality of seeing that felt different from being looked at, and he said, "I would value your recollection of it." Lady Constance, who had entered the library without announcing herself, heard this exchange from the doorway. She said, her voice smooth and correct and calibrated to carry, "The girl cannot sign her name, Lord Wenlock. Whatever recollection she offers, it can have no standing in law. I would not trouble yourself." She left. The door closed. Dorothy stood very still. Lord Wenlock said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That is not entirely accurate." He said it to the papers in front of him, not to Lady Constance's closed door, not to Dorothy. He said it the way a man corrects a factual error in a document he is reading, without heat, without performance. A witness's testimony and a witness's signature are different instruments. One does not require the other. Dorothy did not say anything. Her hand found the disc in her pocket, and she held it. And she thought, soon. The witness she had not expected to become was the kind she was least equipped to be. He did not ask her to produce words on paper, because he already knew she could not produce words on paper. He asked her instead, on the fourth afternoon, to come to the library and to tell him in her own way what she remembered about the morning. The master sealed his will. She told him everything. She told him about the ring, not in the language of a jeweler because she did not have that language, but in the way she would describe any object she had held and cleaned and returned to its proper place 100 times. The weight of it, the width of the shank, the crest on the face, the particular worn place on the left side where the gold had thinned, the color of the impression it made in wax, not quite the color of new wax, because the worn edge affected how the seal settled and left a slight gap on one side. Lord Wenlock had a document on the table, in front of him. He did not tell her what it was. He said, "The seal on this document, if I were to show it to you." "Yes, my lord." He showed her the codicil. She looked at the seal. She looked at it for a long time, the way she looked at anything that had to be understood without letters. Then she reached into her apron pocket, and she placed the wax disc on the table beside the codicil, and she said without drama, "That is the ring. This is not." The room was very quiet. He looked at the disc. He looked at the seal on the codicil. He did not touch either of them. He looked at her, and his face did something she had not seen it do before. It went still in a different way than it was ordinarily, still, the way a man goes, still not from discipline, but from the impact of a specific knowledge, landing with its full weight. He said, "Where did you find this?" She told him. She told him about the study floor, and the morning after the will was sealed, and the quality of the impression, the worn edge present, the gap on the left, exactly as she had described. The ring itself. He was quiet for a very long time. Then, not looking away from the disc, he said, "Miss Penn." And there was something in his voice that she had not heard before and could not name. She would think about it later, in the servants' hall, in the particular silence of a November evening, and she would decide that it sounded like the voice of a man who had been carrying a specific weight for a very long time, and had just been offered, without warning, the possibility that the weight could be set down. He said, "I am going to need to speak with you about what you are prepared to affirm." She said, "I am prepared to affirm what I know." He said, "They will say your testimony has no standing." She said, "I know what they will say." She looked at him steadily. "I have heard it for 22 years, my lord. I am familiar with what they say." He was quiet again. She had noticed, an unusual relationship with silence. He did not fill it reflexively the way many people did, with words that existed only to displace the quiet. He let it stand. He used it. She respected this. He said finally, "You knew about the disc for some weeks." "Yes, my lord." "You kept it." "I did not know what to do with it." "You know now." "I know now," she said, "that someone forged a document, and that Mrs. Norwood will lose her home on the strength of it, and that I am the only person in this house who knows the ring from its impression." She paused. "I am not certain what else there is to know." He looked at her, and the quality of his looking shifted in a way she could feel rather than see, a change in the room's air rather than in any legible expression on his face. He said at last, "There is a solicitor from Lincoln's Inn coming tomorrow. His name is Mr. Forth. He is expert in seals and impression evidence. I would like you to be available to speak with him." "Yes, my lord," she said. She turned to go. She had reached the door when he said her name, not her title or her surname, but her given name, in a voice so quiet, it might have been a question he had not intended to ask aloud. "Dorothy." She stopped. She turned. "Ulcers." His face was as composed as ever, but there was something behind the composure that she recognized from her own face in the servants' hall mirror, on the bad days, the look of a person who has made a decision that cannot be unmade and has not yet determined whether to be afraid of it. He said, "You were right not to discard it." That took a kind of courage most people would not have managed without knowing it was courage. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she said, "I did not know it was courage, my lord. I only knew the shape of the seal." She left. In the passage outside, she pressed her back to the wall for a moment and took a breath, and her hand found the door frame and steadied itself there, and she was aware, in the specific wordless way she was always aware of the most important things, that something had shifted in the arrangement of her life, and she did not yet know what shape it would settle into. There is a kind of darkness that arrives not all at once, but in increments. Dorothy had learned this. The darkness that arrived the following evening came in the form of Mr. Roper. He had been closeted with Vane all afternoon. He emerged in the early evening and requested an audience with Lord Wenlock in the yellow sitting room. And Dorothy, carrying a coal scuttle to the corridor above, heard his voice through the wall. She did not mean to listen. She was becoming this week a woman who could not seem to stop listening. Mr. Roper's voice was the voice of a man performing a service. He said that the girl, the maid, the one Wenlock had been consulting, could not sign her name, and that a witness who could not sign her name had no standing to present testimony regarding a legal document, and that any evidence she produced was of the same legal weight as her word, which was to say, in law, no weight. Dorothy stood in the corridor with the coal scuttle, and she felt the dark moment close around her with its familiar weight, the weight of 22 years of being told that what she saw and knew and remembered existed in a realm entirely beneath the notice of the law. She had thought in the library, in those 2 days of conversation with Lord Wenlock, that something had changed. She had thought that what she knew had value in someone's accounting. She had been wrong before. She had been wrong in exactly this way before. The moment of believing followed by the longer moment of discovering what believing cost. She went down to the servants' hall. Mrs. Ashby found her there an hour later, sitting with her hands around a cup of cold tea, and sat down across from her without speaking for a moment. Then she said, "What will you do?" Dorothy said, "I do not know what I can do, Mrs. Dew." Ashby said, "You have the disc." "The disc is evidence that I understand, and that no one else will credit. Mr. Forth arrives tomorrow." Dorothy looked at her cup. She thought about Mrs. Pry. Norwood's hands folded in her lap at the end of the long table. She thought about the seal on the codicil and the seal on the disc, and the difference between them that she could not articulate in legal language, and could not write down and could not prove in any form the law would recognize. She thought about what Lord Wenlock had said, that she had been right not to discard it, that it had taken a kind of courage. She thought she did not know what Mr. Forth would say. "I do not know what the law allows. I only know that the seal is wrong, and that I have the proof of it, and that Mrs. Norwood's home depends on someone in a position of authority being willing to examine what I know." She looked up. She said, "I will speak to Mr. Forth myself." She did not wait for Lord Wenlock's introduction. This was important, and she understood later that it mattered precisely because she did not wait. Forth in the morning room before breakfast where he was reviewing papers, and she knocked on the open door. And she said, "Forgive me, Mr. Forth, I am Dorothy Penn. I am a housemaid in this house. And I was present when the late master sealed his will, and I have something I would like you to examine." Silas Forth was a small man with the kind of careful face that came from spending a professional lifetime reading documents in insufficient light. He looked at her with precise attention. He said, "Come in, Miss Penn." She placed the wax disc on the table in front of him. She described the ring, the weight of it, the shank's width, the crest, the worn edge on the left side. She described the impression the ring made, the gap it left, the specific way the worn edge prevented the seal from closing fully on one side. She described the difference between the impression on the disc in front of him and the impression on the codicil that Mr. Roper had presented. Mr. Forth did not interrupt her. He listened, the way Lord Wenlock listened, with the full weight of his attention without performing patience, in actual attendance to what she said. When she finished, he picked up the disc and held it under the window light. He took a magnifying glass from his case. He looked at the impression for a long time. Then he went to his case and withdrew the copy of the codicil he had been provided. He placed it beside the disc. He looked from one to the other for a very long time. He said, "Miss Penn, how long have you been maintaining the document archive in this house?" 3 years, Mr. Forth." "By what system?" She told him. She told him the same way she had told Lord Wenlock. Without apology, without hedging, as information. He said, "I should like you to be present this afternoon. I should like Lord Wenlock to be informed of this conversation." He was already reaching for his pen. That afternoon came with the particular gravity of an afternoon that has been arranged around a reckoning. The drawing room at Ashfield Hall was large enough to hold 12 people comfortably, and today it held 14, all of them arranged with the unconscious precision of people who understood that positions in the room would matter before the hour was out. Mr. Forth stood at the long table where the codicil had first been read aloud. Mrs. Norwood sat again at the near end, her hands folded, her face composed. Mr. Vane stood near the window with Mr. Bland, Roper at his shoulder, both of them carrying the settled confidence of men who believe the afternoon's proceedings to be a formality. Lady Constance was arranged in the chair nearest the fire. Lord Wenlock stood at the far end of the table. He had positioned himself there when he came in without announcement, and his face was the still surface Dorothy had been learning to read for a week. The stillness that was not emptiness, but held attention, contained the way a fire is contained in a grate. Dorothy stood near the door. Vane, seeing her, made a small adjustment of his expression, the suppression of something satisfied. He said, addressing the room in the way of a man who has no objection to an audience, "I understand we are to be subject to the impressions of a girl who cannot sign her name." He did not look at Dorothy when he said it. He said it to the room, pleasantly, as though the absurdity of the situation excused him from the need to address it directly. "I confess I am at a loss as to what law permits it." Forth said without looking up from the documents on the table, "The law permits considerable latitude in the examination of material evidence, Mr. Vane. A witness's testimony and a witness's literacy are separate instruments." He said this in the dry, precise tone of a man who has spent 30 years distinguishing between what the law actually said and what people wished it had said. There was a brief silence. Lady Constance's fan opened a precise 2 inches. Mr. Chua's go. Forth presented his examination in the language of his profession, which was the language of measured specificity. He had examined the seal on the disputed codicil. He had examined the wax disc she had produced, which bore an impression of the late master's signet ring. He had found on examination 17 points of measurable discrepancy between the 2 impressions. He described these discrepancies in order. He used technical language where technical language applied, and plain language where it did not. He said it plainly. The codicil was not sealed with the ring that sealed the original will. "Mr. Gens," Roper said something about the limitations of impression evidence. Mr. Forth addressed the limitations of impression evidence with the patience of a man who has heard this objection many times and has the answer for it at close hand. Lord Wenlock did not speak during this exchange. He stood at the end of the table, and he watched, and his face did not change. And Dorothy, watching him from the door, understood that this was what he had been doing for a week, building methodically the architecture of a reckoning and waiting with complete and quiet patience for the moment when it would land. Mr. Roper made a final argument that even if the impression evidence held, there was no corroborating witness with legal standing to affirm the chain of custody of the disc. He said, and his voice had acquired a slight edge of the defensive, the sound of an argument being pressed harder than it warranted, that a woman who could not sign her name could not be permitted to anchor a chain of evidentiary custody. Lord Wenlock moved. He had been still for the better part of an hour, and then he moved. 3 unhurried strides to the center of the table, and he placed before Mr. Forth a document that Dorothy had not seen before. He said Miss Penn's statement has been witnessed by 2 members of this household, and countersigned by myself as a member of the peerage. Her mark, he said, and here he paused a single beat, is on the record. He turned his head and looked at Mr. Roper. He said, level, his voice at the register of a man who has no need to raise it. Her mark is here. The seal is not. The will stands. The room was very quiet. Vane made a small movement near the window, a reorientation of his body, the physical grammar of a man who has begun to understand that the ground has shifted without having entirely accepted it. Yet Mr. Redder. Roper looked at the document Lord Wenlock had placed on the table, and then he looked at Mr. Forth, and then he looked at the floor. Lady Constance said nothing. Her fan had stilled at the precise angle at which she had opened it, and she sat with the particular motionlessness of a woman who has built her confidence on an account of the world that is in the process of being corrected in front of witnesses. Mrs. Norwood said nothing either. She sat at the near end of the table with her hands still folded and her eyes on Mr. Twania. Forth's face, and then she looked at Dorothy. And what passed across her face was something Dorothy did not have a word for, a softening, a release, the particular expression of someone who has been very frightened for a long time and has just been permitted to stop. Mr. Forth said he would require the codicil to be referred to a magistrate. He said he would require the attendance of Mr. Vane and his solicitor for that purpose. He said this with the precision and calm of a man issuing the final items on a list that had been prepared in advance. Because it had. He closed his case. He looked at Dorothy briefly with the expression of a professional who does not compliment but does register. And then he turned back to his papers. It was over in the way these things are. Over, not with fanfare, but with the steady procedural machinery of consequence catching up to what it had always been going to catch. Vane left with Mr. Dass. Roper, in a state of contained and careful quiet, the quiet of men calculating what remains retrievable. Lady Constance rose and took her leave of Mrs. Secht. Norwood, with the compressed dignity of a woman performing a courtesy under extreme circumstances, and she did not look at Dorothy as she passed. The room thinned. Mrs. Norwood crossed to Dorothy and took her hand and held it for a moment without speaking, and her eyes were bright, and then she seemed to decide that anything she said would be inadequate to what she felt, and she pressed Dorothy's hand once and released it, and went to find Mrs. Bertha Ashby. Dorothy stood in the drawing-room, which was quieter now, and she looked at the long table, and she looked at the place where the codicil had been, which was empty, and she looked at the window, through which the November afternoon light was doing its habitual gray compression. Lord Wenlock was at the far end of the room. She had not seen him approach. He moved the way he was often still without announcement, without unnecessary signal. He stood perhaps 6 feet away, and he looked at her with the full quality of his attention, which she had come to understand was not something he gave carelessly. He said, "Are you well, Miss Penn?" She said, "Yes, my lord." He looked at her for another moment. He said, "What you did this morning, going to Forth directly, without waiting. That was not the action of a woman who does not understand her situation." She said, "I understood that if I waited for the right moment, it might not come." He said, "Yes." He said it as though it confirmed something, not as though it surprised him. He looked at the table, the empty space where the codicil had been, and she thought she saw in his face, very briefly, the faint resolution of something that had been held for a long time under considerable pressure. Then he looked at her again, and the resolution shifted into something quieter, something she recognized from the moment in the library when she had placed the disc on the table between them. He said, "I should like to return this to you." He held out his hand, and on his palm was the wax disc. She looked at it. She said, "It is evidence. It has served as evidence. It will be entered in the record." Mr. Forth made a copy of the impression. "And the original," he said, pausing as she thought she saw very briefly in the set of his mouth something close to the beginning of a smile. "It belongs to the person who kept it safe." She took it from his hand. The transfer lasted a moment, no longer. Her fingers closed around the disc, and the worn edge of the impression pressed into her palm. Familiar. The way everything she had ever truly known was familiar, by texture and weight and the specific shape of what had been pressed into it. She said, "Thank you, my lord." He said Edward quietly, without performance, the way a man names himself when he means to be known. "I would prefer, in time, if you were to call me Edward." She looked at him. The light in the drawing room was the particular gray gold of a November afternoon that had resolved, unexpectedly, into something approximating warmth, and it came through the west-facing windows at an angle that caught the dust still settling from an afternoon of reckoning. She was a maid in a household in which she had served for 6 years, and she had no letters, and she had no property, and she could not sign her name to anything but her own mark, and she held in her hand a disc of red wax that had helped stop a forgery, and a man of rank was asking her to call him by his name. She said that will require some adjustment. He said, "I am aware," and this time, unmistakably, the thing at the corner of his mouth was the thing it had been on the verge of being for days. Not quite a smile. Not yet, but its immediate and very near predecessor. It changed his face in a way that did something particular to her breathing, and she was grateful briefly that she was standing near the door and could find the frame with her hand without his noticing. She did not call him by his name that day. She went back to the servants' hall, and she sat with Mrs. Ashby, and she held the wax disc in both hands, and Ashby made tea that was actually hot, and the fire was built up because coal was no longer rationed in a house that had just recovered its future, and Dorothy sat with the warmth of it across her face, and she did not speak for a long time. And Mrs. Maker, Ashby, who was a woman who knew when not to speak, did not speak either. Sometime in the next weeks the manner of things between them changed, as the manner of things does between people who have stood on the same side of a moment that mattered. He found reasons to consult her about the archive. She found incrementally and without ceremony that the reasons were not entirely about the archive. He asked her once in the library whether she would be interested in having someone read to her, whether it was something she had wanted and had not found access to. She said she had been offered it and had declined, because being read to had always felt like being shown a country whose border she could not cross. He said, "There are other countries." She did not ask him what he meant. She understood what he meant. Spring came slowly to Ashfield Hall. The dispossession had been overturned. Vane had withdrawn his claim when the magistrate's examination confirmed Mr. Chenemy Forth's findings, and he had departed with Lady Constance in a carriage whose silence had a very particular quality, the silence of people reordering a story they had been confident about and must now revise. Mrs. Norwood had the house back, and the income attached to it, and she had spent a considerable portion of a Tuesday afternoon crying with relief in the morning room while Mrs. Ashby stood outside the door in case she was needed. Dorothy stayed. She had not been asked to go anywhere, and she had not thought of going anywhere. And if that was a form of waiting, she was not yet prepared to name, she permitted it to be unnamed. He stayed longer than the matter required. She noticed this. She noticed it, the way she noticed everything, by the texture of it, by the particular shape of his continued presence, by the way the library had acquired a second person's habits without either of them having agreed that it would. In April, when the first warm afternoon arrived, with the particular quality of warmth that feels like permission rather than weather, he walked with her in the Ashfield grounds, at a distance that was entirely correct and deliberate, and they talked about, of all things, the archive, about the system she had built, about what a person who understood every object by touch and weight and color and texture could see that a person who read the label on a thing sometimes could not. He said, "I had a ward, a young woman. I did not pay enough attention to a document she signed because I trusted someone I should not have trusted. She died before I understood what the document had cost her." He said it without self-excuse. "I have been attentive to documents since then," she said. "I know." She said it without explanation. She had been watching him the way she watched everything, and had already understood this about him without the words being said. He stopped walking. He looked at her, and the light was the April light that falls on English grounds with a peculiar and specific generosity. And his face was not still in the way it ordinarily was. Still, it was open in a way she had not seen it before. Opened rather the way a room is opened when the shutters have been kept for a long time and someone finally takes them down. He said her name, Dorothy. He said it in the way she had heard him say it once before in the library, as a question he had not meant to speak aloud, except now he did mean to speak it aloud. Now it was not a question. She said, "Yes, my lord," very quietly. "Play shh," he said. Edward just as quietly. She looked at him in the April light. She said, with the ghost of something she would not yet call amusement, because she did not quite have his ease yet, but was acquiring it. "Edward." The distance between them had been entirely correct, all morning, all week, all the weeks of the preceding months. It closed. Now, by increments, in the way that distances close when two people have both decided, without coordination, to allow it. She was aware of the warmth of him at close range, the specific warmth of a person rather than weather, and she was aware of her own breathing, and she was aware of the April air, and she was aware that his hand was near her hand, and that this proximity was not accidental. He said very low, "You are the only person who saw what you saw." She said, "I know." She looked up at him. "I was not surprised. I have usually been the only person who saw what I saw." He said nothing. He lifted his hand and placed it against her face, a slow and careful gesture, the gesture of a man who is touching something he has been permitted to touch and is aware of the permission. She did not move away. His thumb traced the line of her jaw with the same quality of attention she had seen him give to documents, to seal impressions, to objects that required understanding by more than their surface. She said nothing. She put her hand over his, and the wax disc was in her apron pocket, and the worn edge of it pressed against her through the cloth, and she thought, "This is the shape of a thing recognized." He kissed her, as the day in April continued on its generous axis, softly and with great care, as though she were something he had been given to hold rather than to keep. And then, when she did not step back, with the warmer conviction of a man discovering that he has been given something to keep after all. It was brief. It was enough. When he drew back, his face was the open face, the shutterless one, and she understood that this was what he looked like when he was not protecting himself. She said after a moment, "I should return to the house." He said, "Yes." He said it in the way he said things he agreed with, but did not particularly want to agree with. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked back across the grounds in the April light at a distance that was now a different kind of deliberate, and she thought about how this was what it looked like when a life changed its shape. Not a dramatic alteration, not a public proclamation, but two people crossing a stretch of ground together, and both of them knowing without saying it, that the ground they were crossing led somewhere neither of them had been. That evening, Dorothy sat by the fire in the servants' hall, alone for once with the wax disc in her hand. She turned it over, feeling the impression of the ring on one side, the smooth plain wax on the other. She had been told many times in many registers that she had no standing, that what she could not write, she could not affirm, that what she could not read, she could not understand, that her mark was a lesser thing, an absence given a shape. She held the disc and she felt the worn edge of the impression under her thumb, the exact place where the ring's gold had thinned over years of use, the place that made the impression specific to this ring, this master, this will. She had seen what no one else had seen. She had kept what no one else had kept. She had presented it, without permission or introduction, to the one man in the house equipped to understand it. And she had done so because she understood that waiting for someone to grant her standing was not the same as standing. Mrs. Ashby came in and set a fresh candle on the table, and the fire shifted and brightened, and outside the window the spring dark was soft and full of the particular smell of Shropshire in April, and she held the disc in her hand and she turned thoughts over with the disc. She knew the shape of a thing. I know it by touch. I know it by feel. I know it when it is the right shape, and I know it when it is not. She thought that had always been enough. She had simply been waiting for the world to agree with her. She put the disc in her pocket. She stayed by the fire until it was time to bank it for the night. And if, in the quiet of that room, in the particular warmth of a spring evening in a house that had been restored to the person it belonged to, she permitted herself to think of the April afternoon, with the feeling of a woman who had found a territory she was not required to read in order to inhabit. The way she held all things that mattered, she had never needed letters for that.